Objective IELTS Advanced by Michael Black and Annette Capel. Published by Cambridge University Press. Unit 1. Information Overload. 1.1. Exercise 6. Part 1.
Who are the three speakers? Why are they having a meeting together?
Hello, Dr. Lucas.
Mark, welcome and thanks for coming along to share your experience with us today as a final year student. Can I introduce you to Jenny Boylan, who's in her first term here?
Hi, Jenny. And how are you enjoying university life?
It's great, though I'm having a few problems on the study side.
Well, that's exactly why I've arranged for us all to be here this morning.
The older woman, Dr. Lucas, has set up the meeting so that Jenny, a new student, can get some advice about studying from Mark, who is in his final year.
Part 2.
What did Mark find difficult when he started at university? Was it the subject he was studying or something else?
Well, that's exactly why I've arranged for us all to be here this morning. Now, Jenny, the first thing to say is, don't worry. Many students feel a bit at sea with their study techniques to begin with. Isn't that right, Mark?
Definitely. When I started here, I found it so different from school. It wasn't that the subject itself was suddenly more challenging. I've always loved history and been confident in my field. But at school, I really only had to use a couple of core textbooks to find out what I needed. While here at uni, I was presented with huge resources, the library, the internet, with little idea of how to use them efficiently.
Exactly. The main problem I seem to have is time wasting. I can spend a whole day in the library and come away feeling I haven't really scratched the surface.
Mark didn't find his subject, history, any more difficult. His problem at first was learning how to cope with much bigger reference sources than he had had to use at school.
Part 3.
What two things does Mark suggest Jenny should do from now on when she's in the library?
Could you give us a concrete example of what you see as time wasting, Jenny?
Well, yesterday I had to do some background reading for an essay. I took down a big book from the shelves, thinking it would be useful. The title seemed to fit my essay topic, but it was hopeless. I sat there with it for nearly 2 hours, reading chapter after chapter, thinking that eventually I'd find what I needed. But it never happened.
OK, Jenny, first piece of advice. Don't wander along the library shelves looking at book spines. Titles can be very misleading. You'll save time by putting yourself in front of a computer and using the search tools to locate books or articles on your topic. Didn't they explain this to you on the library tour at the start of term?
I forgot to go.
OK, well, make sure you fix up another tour immediately. They're still running them once a week, you know.
And another suggestion, Jenny. Don't just rely on books. You're likely to find much more up-to-date information in periodicals and journals, you know.
Right. I'll look for those then.
Mark advises Jenny to use the library's electronic search tools. He also advises her to look for relevant articles in periodicals and journals instead of only using books.
Part 4.
Why does Dr. Lucas warn Jenny about using the internet as a source?
And what do you both think about using the internet?
Well, it isn't always used very productively. Sure, you can get lucky and find something really useful, but other days you may retrieve virtually nothing. And perhaps even worse, sometimes you're totally inundated with possible material, and then you don't know where to start.
Mark's right. I think you have to be extremely careful in this area, especially in assessing the accuracy of the facts themselves. You see, there are no quality controls on the web. Information can become out of date or maybe false or biased to start with. Use it by all means, but always evaluate what you find. You must be absolutely certain of all the sources you quote in essays.
I've got a lot to learn, haven't I?
That's true, but we're here to support you. You shouldn't feel embarrassed about asking me for more help and advice, and Mark is willing to act as your student mentor too.
In fact, why don't we go for a coffee now? Then we can get to know each other a bit better.
Thanks, I'd like that. And thank you, Dr. Lucas. It's been really helpful.
I'm pleased. Right, off you go then.
Dr. Lucas explains to Jenny information on the internet isn't always reliable because it may be out of date, inaccurate or biased.
(1.1) Exercise 7. Part 2.
Well, that's exactly why I've arranged for us all to be here this morning. Now, Jenny, the first thing to say is, don't worry. Many students feel a bit at sea with their study techniques to begin with. Isn't that right, Mark?
Definitely. When I started here, I found it so different from school. It wasn't that the subject itself was suddenly more challenging. I've always loved history and been confident in my field. But at school, I really only had to use a couple of core textbooks to find out what I needed. While here at uni, I was presented with huge resources, the library, the internet, with little idea of how to use them efficiently.
Exactly. The main problem I seem to have is time wasting. I can spend a whole day in the library and come away feeling I haven't really scratched the surface.
Part 3.
Could you give us a concrete example of what you see as time wasting, Jenny?
Well, yesterday I had to do some background reading for an essay. I took down a big book from the shelves, thinking it would be useful. The title seemed to fit my essay topic, but it was hopeless. I sat there with it for nearly 2 hours, reading chapter after chapter, thinking that eventually I'd find what I needed. But it never happened.
OK, Jenny, first piece of advice. Don't wander along the library shelves looking at book spines. Titles can be very misleading. You'll save time by putting yourself in front of a computer and using the search tools to locate books or articles on your topic. Didn't they explain this to you on the library tour at the start of term?
I forgot to go.
OK, well, make sure you fix up another tour immediately. They're still running them once a week, you know.
And another suggestion, Jenny. Don't just rely on books. You're likely to find much more up-to-date information in periodicals and journals, you know.
Right. I'll look for those then.
Part 4.
And what do you both think about using the internet?
Well, it isn't always used very productively. Sure, you can get lucky and find something really useful, but other days you may retrieve virtually nothing. And perhaps even worse, sometimes you're totally inundated with possible material, and then you don't know where to start.
Mark's right. I think you have to be extremely careful in this area, especially in assessing the accuracy of the facts themselves. You see, there are no quality controls on the web. Information can become out of date or maybe false or biased to start with. Use it by all means, but always evaluate what you find. You must be absolutely certain of all the sources you quote in essays.
I've got a lot to learn, haven't I?
That's true, but we're here to support you. You shouldn't feel embarrassed about asking me for more help and advice, and Mark is willing to act as your student mentor too.
In fact, why don't we go for a coffee now? Then we can get to know each other a bit better.
Thanks, I'd like that. And thank you, Dr. Lucas. It's been really helpful.
I'm pleased. Right, off you go then.
Unit 2. Only a game. 2.2. Exercise 3.
Hello, Pirko. I'm phoning to let you know that my college basketball team are very keen to come over to Finland to take part in the Tampere Student Games.
Well, that's great. We're hoping to make it a really special event this year, as it's the 80th anniversary of Finnish student sport.
Fantastic. We're all looking forward to coming. Let me just check. The game starts on May the 19th, right?
Oh, that was the provisional plan when you first contacted me, that they'd run from the 19th to the 23rd. But we've cut the program by a day, so now it'll begin on the 20th, still ending on the 23rd. There's going to be an opening ceremony on the first evening.
We don't want to miss that, do we? And how much is the entry fee for the games?
This year it's gone up from 16 to 18 euros a day per person, I'm afraid. But you get a lot for that.
How do you mean?
Well, of course it covers the competition entrance, but you also get 3 meals a day and even floor space if you want it. We can't manage beds for everyone.
Sounds a bit basic to me. Can you recommend a hotel?
Well, Tampere is quite a big city, so there are a lot of hotels. The Homeland would be convenient if you come by train, or maybe you'd prefer the Hermica, as it's offering a reduced rate for participants in the games. It's spelled Hermica. It's a very nice hotel.
And where is it exactly?
Well, that's the other good thing from your point of view. It's in the Hervanta district of Tampere, near the University of Technology.
And why is that good for us?
Because all the basketball matches are taking place near there.
Oh, I see.
Look, why don't I give you the website address and then you can look up the program and find out anything else you need to know.
Good idea. So, what is it?
Okay, it's www.cellgames. That's SELLGAMES.com.
Brilliant. I'll have a look now. Thanks, Pirko.
See you soon then. Bye, John.
Unit 3. Brands. 3.1. Exercise 2. Questions 1 and 2.
At first sight, a bank account may seem very different from a laptop or a university, but what they have in common is that they're all products. Until relatively recently, the term tended to be restricted to manufactured goods, such as furniture or books, but now it's applied to virtually anything that's the focus of marketing activity. That is, activity to attract the attention of the general public, or perhaps companies. In terms of business, though, products are generally either manufactured goods, such as a laptop, or services, like bank accounts or training courses. But because the purpose of the producer is to sell, pop singers, holiday resorts and so on can also be marketed as products, the purpose being to publicise that particular pop singer, etc. These days, more and more people are even managing themselves as a product, for instance when applying for jobs.
Questions 3 to 9.
In this analysis of products, it's consumer goods that I'll focus on first. These are products that are manufactured and sold to members of the public, or consumers, rather than to companies. Normally, with consumer goods, a number of manufacturers make similar products and compete for sales. Levi Strauss has manufactured jeans since 1873, and until the early 1960s, it was unusual in that it had virtually no competition. Since then, a lot of other manufacturers have entered the market. As a result, Levi's market share, that is, its percentage of all the pairs of jeans that are sold, has fallen dramatically. Marketing is all about getting people to buy from you. One way of achieving this is by advertising, but another crucial element is the creation of brands. Until the late 19th century, it was simply soap that people bought, or a dress, or whatever. But then manufacturers, including the soap maker Pears, began to realise that by giving their product its own name and advertising it to the general public, they could encourage purchasers to ask for their goods and not those of a competitor. By the early 20th century, advertising was to be seen everywhere. Brand names fall into two basic categories: Some manufacturers, like Microsoft, create a strong identification between the company and all its products by using the same name for both. Other companies use a variety of brand names. Procter & Gamble produces around 300 brands altogether, and it also sells several washing powders under different brand names in order to maximise sales. Tide, Ariel and Daz are just 3 of these. Often, companies manufacture a product line. Take the car manufacturer Ford, for instance. One of its cars, the Focus, is a product line consisting of closely related versions of one product sold under the same brand name. All the brands and products that a company produces make up its product mix. Ford specialises in one type of product, cars, while Yamaha has a much more diverse product mix, which includes motorcycles, musical instruments and electronic equipment. Now let's turn briefly to retailers, such as the supermarket chain Tesco. Retailers are businesses which sell directly to consumers, usually in their stores or retail outlets, but in some cases by mail order or through the internet. They usually sell branded goods, which they've received from the manufacturer. But, like Tesco, they may also sell their own brands, which are normally goods that they buy from a manufacturer and sell under their own name. So, for example, alongside the Heinz brand of baked beans, Tesco also sells Tesco baked beans. A brand doesn't just have a name, however. Most have a logo which the company wants the public to associate with the brand. Coca-Cola's logo, for example, is the distinctive way in which the name is written. Now, I just want to mention one or two others.
Unit 4. Spotlight on Communication. 4.2. Exercise 2. Questions 1 to 4.
It's a striking feature of languages that different varieties acquire different social values. Any social group develops norms of behaviour, such as wearing certain styles of clothes, and members of the group are expected to conform to those norms. Since language is a form of behaviour, the group develops a distinct variety of language too, which helps to maintain and signal group identity. This variety comes to reflect the social status of its users. The higher this is, the greater the prestige of the variety of language. Standard varieties of languages serve the needs of the national rather than the local community, and are associated with the goals and values of nations. People who use standard varieties tend to be well educated, so the standard is usually thought of as a model of correct language, and other varieties as incorrect. All varieties of language reflect social relationships, and the judgments we make about language are often disguised social judgments. For instance, when parents tell their child off for using slang expressions, it's probably because they're afraid that other people will think the child is of lower status than they wish him or her to be considered.
Questions 5 to 7.
In fact, the English are very aware of social differences in accent, and can usually work out from it a person's region of origin, social standing, and standard of education. Accents are also classified aesthetically. In one experiment, it was found that British people, who recognised where each accent came from, preferred rural accents to ones from British cities such as Birmingham or Liverpool. However, people from other countries, without that knowledge or the social attitudes that go with it, assess the pleasantness of the accents differently. Language is also a symbol of identity. People from a particular region, such as Yorkshire in the north of England, may take pride in their local speech as part of their pride in their local culture, and may make an effort to retain their accent if they move to another part of the country. Attitudes towards different varieties of language can be remarkably powerful. In another piece of research, people listened to the same argument against capital punishment, spoken with different accents. Some accents were effective in changing people's views on this matter, while others weren't. Listeners were also asked to rate the quality of the argument. Generally, when the case was argued in an accent of high prestige, it was thought to be better argued than when presented in accents of lower prestige. Clearly, we need to be careful about how far our attitude to other people is affected by our reaction to their speech.
Progress Test 1. This test is in the teacher's book. You will hear a man phoning a company about a job. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 5. Now listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 5.
Good morning, Human Resources Department. Cheryl speaking.
Oh, hello. My name's Jeff Brooks. Are you the right person to speak to about the marketing jobs you're advertising?
Yes, I am. Which one are you interested in?
The vacancy for a market research assistant.
Ah, yes. Well, let me start by telling you something about the company. Ackroyd Music has 3 main divisions. One produces music videos and DVDs. There's the CD division, and the job you're interested in is in our online music division, which we're currently in the process of setting up.
What does the job involve?
It's part of a team that at first will be carrying out research into our existing customers so that we can target our advertising more effectively. We already have a data bank in which sales are analysed according to customer profile. That is their age, sex, where they live and so on. This particular post is for someone to build on that by discovering what people think of the Ackroyd brand, both customers and non-customers. That information will help to determine the way that we plan our advertising in future.
I see.
As for getting the information, we already have questionnaires used by our other divisions, which will need to be adapted, probably by one of our existing staff. The new assistant will be required to lead focus groups of potential customers, and then there'll also be telephone interviews, which other team members will carry out.
Right.
Now, the new division will come into existence next March, but the appointment is from April, because that's the earliest the new marketing manager can start. We're hoping to choose all the new staff by February, so people can give a few weeks' notice to their present employers before they start work.
Right. What are you looking for in applicants for this position?
We want someone who's enthusiastic about music and can convey that enthusiasm to potential customers. A qualification in marketing would be good, but it isn't essential. We'll provide training ourselves if necessary, and similarly, relevant experience is desirable, but we want someone who's quick to learn, even if they're new to this type of work.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 6 to 10. Now listen and answer questions 6 to 10.
Now, I expect you'd like to know the starting salary. The scale for research assistants is £16,000 to £20,000 a year, but for this post we're appointing at £18,000 in recognition of the fact that it'll be a pretty demanding role, especially at first. There are some additional benefits too, including a car and possibly pension contributions, though that hasn't been decided yet.
OK. Now, the advert said the job will be based in the east of England. Will it be at your London office?
No, this division will be at a new location in Jaywick.
I've never heard of it. How do you spell it?
Jaywyck. It's quite small, so I'm not surprised you haven't heard of it. It's near Southend.
So it isn't very far from London. That's where I live, and I'm hoping not to have to move.
It's about 30 kilometres east of central London and 10 kilometres from the coast. The person appointed will need to spend 1 or 2 days a week in London as well.
Oh, that sounds perfect. Well, I'm very interested, so could you send me an application form, please?
Of course. I can send you one by email, but you'll need to get it back to us by post, along with a covering letter and copies of certificates of all exams you've passed.
OK. Well, my email address is jeff.brooks.
Unit 5. Is plastic fantastic? 5.1. Exercise 5. Questions 1 to 5.
There are so many different types of plastic, and it's such a versatile material that it's now used in thousands of ways, and we find it difficult to imagine living without it. Plastics are the choice for so many products, featuring in different areas of our lives at the moment, from car parts to toy parts, from soft drink bottles to the refrigerators they're stored in. I believe that there are 3 main reasons why plastics have scored over other materials in satisfying the consumer's needs. These are safety, performance, and last but not least, value. Just consider the changes we've seen in the food retail business in recent years. The introduction of plastic bottles has meant that even an economy-sized bottle of juice can easily be lifted. Glass is much heavier, of course. And should you accidentally drop that bottle, it's far less likely to break. Plastic wrap helps keep food fresh and free from contamination, which is particularly important with meat. In each case, plastics help to make your life easier, healthier, and, of course, safer. Plastics also help you get maximum value from some of the high-cost items you need to buy. They ensure that cell phones and laptop computers really are light and easy to carry. They help to make sure that major appliances, like refrigerators and dishwashers, will resist the corrosive effects of moisture and certain chemicals, which guarantees they'll last longer. These appliances also operate more efficiently thanks to the use of plastics. Food safety is of key importance to the consumer, and packaging, such as heat-sealed plastic pouches and wraps, means the resources that went into producing the food in the first place aren't wasted. It's the same thing once you get the food home, where resealable plastic containers keep your leftovers protected. In fact, packaging experts have estimated that every kilo of plastic packaging can cut food waste by 3.74 kilos. That's a statistic that very few people are aware of. Plastics also help to conserve energy in your home, lowering your heating and cooling bills by cutting electricity consumption. Indeed, plastic parts and insulation have helped to improve the energy efficiency of air conditioners by up to 50% since the 1970s. And these appliances run more quietly than earlier designs that used other materials. In short, I believe plastics are a very good thing for the human race.
Questions 6 to 10.
In the opinion of a growing number of environmental campaigners, the plastic bag is an unnecessary and damaging item that we should get rid of at all costs. This simple innovation, which was welcomed in the 1950s as an attractive modern material with many practical applications, is now seen by many as a major source of pollution. 1957 saw the launch of the sandwich bag, first produced and promoted in the USA as a good way of keeping lunchtime snacks fresh and clean. American companies quickly recognised the value of plastic bags, and by 1966, the bread industry, for instance, used them for about 1/3 of packaging. But it wasn't just in the area of food packaging that the plastic bag was beginning to enjoy success. In 1969, the New York City Sanitation Department's New York City experiment showed how much cleaner, safer and quieter it was to use plastic bags in garbage collection, and the public soon started to line their metal trash cans with specially produced bags. However, even in the late 1960s, people were still bringing home their shopping in baskets or brown paper sacks. The commercial production of plastic grocery bags didn't start until 1973, with the opening of the first manufacturing plant. The plastic carrier bag soon became an indispensable part of everyone's life, something that governments and campaigners worldwide are now trying to reverse. In 2002, for example, the Irish government introduced a new tax payable by consumers of 15 cents a bag, which in the 2 years following its introduction raised €23 million for environmental projects. In the same year, the government of another country, Bangladesh, had to take a more drastic approach, banning the production of plastic bags and introducing an on-the-spot fine for using one. Since then, many governments have introduced similar measures, and it now seems that the days of the plastic bag may indeed be numbered.
5.1 Exercise 7 1.
For the walk, you'll need to bring sandwiches, chocolate and, most importantly, plenty of water.
2.
The product comes in 4 colours: red, green, blue and, unusually, purple.
3.
During the experiment, you should monitor your temperature, pulse and, last but not least, heart rate.
4.
In August, the weather will be a bit windy, dry and, without a doubt, sunny.
5.
Plastics are used in computers, televisions and, naturally, mobile phones.
Test folder 3. Exercise 1. 1.
What type of food do you enjoy most?
Fruit.
2.
Do you enjoy cooking?
I don't eat much for breakfast or lunch. I usually have my main meal in the evening.
3.
Why do some people avoid eating food they're not familiar with?
I'm not altogether sure, but maybe they were brought up to eat only what they know is safe.
4.
Do you have any plans affecting your work?
I have plans, yes, certainly. I want to live in Canada or find a nice apartment. On the other hand, it's work too.
5.
Do you think it's important to visit other countries?
Yes. Maybe people should go abroad so that they can compare that country with their own.
Test folder 3. Exercise 3.
I'd like you to describe an occasion when you were pleased that an object was made of plastic.
Right. Well, I'd like to tell you about a plastic fork. Once I was sitting in a motorway cafe with a friend. We were on our way to see some other friends for the weekend, and it was quite a long drive, so we stopped to have a break. I was eating a cake which was full of chocolate and cream. It was very tasty, but I was using a plastic fork that was quite small and not very practical. I was annoyed that the cafe didn't supply metal ones. Anyway, we were sitting there chatting and eating when a group of children and a couple of adults came into the cafe. The children were aged about 7 or 8, and they were running around chasing each other. The adults weren't doing anything to stop them, and I commented on this to my friend. Then, as they came past our table, one of the children pushed another one who fell heavily against me, jerking my right arm across my body, and I was holding the fork in my right hand. The fork hit my left arm, scratched the inside of my elbow, and covered that part of my arm with chocolate and cream. Luckily, the scratch wasn't serious, and when I'd washed my arm, I was fine. But I was glad the fork was made of plastic. If it had been metal, it would probably have broken the skin and made me bleed.
Do you think anyone watching what happened felt the same way as you?
They probably thought it was funny, but I hope they'd have been pleased that the fork didn't hurt me.
On the whole, do you prefer plastic or more traditional materials?
I usually prefer traditional materials like wood or cloth, but sometimes it's better to have plastic.
Test Folder 3. Exercise 5.
Could you describe how people use plastic credit cards?
Yes, they are used instead of cash to buy goods in shops or pay bills. They can be used for paying online too, when you just need to give the number on the card and some other details.
Can you contrast carrying credit cards with carrying cash?
I think the biggest difference is that when you pay for something with a credit card, you don't really feel that you are spending money. So the danger is that you spend far too much.
Can you identify ways in which credit cards have changed our spending habits?
When we see something we want but can't afford it, in the past we generally saved up to buy it, but nowadays we're much more likely to buy it on credit card. So as a result, a lot of people get into debt.
6.2. Exercise 2. Example.
Chris, we need to get on with planning our performance.
OK, Hannah. Are you happy with the pieces of music that we chose?
Yes, they're fine.
Right. So we need to choose what should be happening during each piece. We'll be performing in the college theatre, so there's a good sound system for the recordings. We'll have the stage for the live action, and there'll be a giant screen at the back of the stage that the film and slides will be projected onto.
Excellent.
Have you got the running order of the music we agreed on?
Yes, here it is. The first piece is that exciting section from Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture. What do you think would go well with it?
How about one of us reading a really dramatic speech?
But the music's very loud. It'd be impossible to hear any kind of speech even if we shouted. I think projecting a film of a firework display onto the screen would work better.
Well, it would certainly get everyone's attention. OK, we'll do that.
Questions 1 to 8.
What's next?
The Balinese Gamelan Orchestra. It's a very delicate sound, as though the instruments are some distance away and the sound is being carried by the wind.
How about if we stand on opposite sides of the stage and say sentences that aren't connected, as though the audience is hearing snatches of different conversations blown by the wind?
Nice. Then the mood changes with a Jamaican steel band. That's very upbeat and exhilarating. I'd like us to do some tap dancing in a factory surrounded by steel drums.
In a factory? Oh, film us there, you mean? Yeah, good idea. I'll find out about possible locations.
Next, it's the Indian sitar music.
I think we should have someone on stage doing traditional Indian dancing. In fact, I know just the person, Jayashree Begum. I'm sure she'd agree to do it.
Perfect. OK, then Then the next piece of music is the South American panpipes. Any ideas?
I could recite a South American poem.
Or maybe we could have some pipes and mime playing them ourselves.
Isn't that too literal? I'd like to be a bit more imaginative.
Maybe you're right. OK, we'll have the poem. With you in a spotlight and the rest of the stage in darkness.
Right. It's all beginning to take shape, isn't it?
Yeah. Now, the next piece is the slow part of Mahler's Fifth Symphony. I imagine this starting with the stage still in pitch darkness. Then the lights come up very slowly. So the audience gradually realises there are people standing there, absolutely motionless.
Maybe lit from behind, so we're in silhouette.
Lovely. And then we start swaying and doing very stylised, formal gestures, mostly with the arms.
Oh, that sounds great. Right, what's next?
The African band. You know, the one from Mali.
Ah, yes. That'll be a complete contrast. Really lively. It'll make people want to leap to their feet and fling themselves around. How about getting the audience to dance?
What? Suddenly shout out, "Everybody stand up and dance!" I don't think so. I'd rather we created a sense of place and endless time, with slides of Mali showing the Sahara Desert, Timbuktu, some of the ruins, each one dissolving into the next. It'd be a striking contrast with the music.
I still like the idea of audience participation.
But it would be awfully embarrassing if we asked them to dance and they didn't.
Yeah, I suppose so. OK, we'll go with your idea.
Right.
And the next section?
That's the didgeridoo.
Oh.
As it's an Australian Aboriginal instrument and so unusual, maybe we could show a film clip of it being played.
Or we could learn some traditional Aboriginal dancing.
No time. I know. How about a complete contrast to make people sit up and think? We could do a comedy sketch, standing quite still on opposite sides of the stage. If we get the timing right, we could fit the sound of the didgeridoo to the words.
Hannah, that's an absolutely crazy idea.
Oh.
And I love it.
Thank you. Well, the last piece is the electronic music by that German group, Kraftwerk. That'd really lend itself to a way-out gymnastics display.
Maybe some film footage of the Olympic Games from years ago.
Or we could ask the college gym team to perform on stage.
Yes, let's do that. After all, we want to involve a lot of people in this.
OK, well, there's plenty for us to do, isn't there? So why don't we start...
Unit 7. Worlds to Explore. 7.2. Exercise 2. Questions 1 to 4.
There are two main types of device in which people can travel underwater. Diving bells, which are lowered and raised from the surface and can't be propelled forwards, and submarines, which do have a means of propulsion. It's possible that Alexander the Great descended into the sea in a diving bell 2,300 years ago, although this hasn't been proved, and some sort of submarine may also have existed in China not long afterwards. The first workable submarine of recent times was designed and built in 1620 by a Dutch doctor living in London, Cornelius van Drebbel. This was a fully enclosed boat, propelled by the crew, who used oars, as in a normal rowing boat. The crew breathed air through tubes from the surface of the water. The submarine travelled along the River Thames for several hours, at a depth of over 4 metres. Later in the 17th century, the British astronomer Edmund Halley patented a diving bell linked by pipes to barrels of air. Manned descents to depths of over 18 metres, lasting up to 90 minutes, proved that diving bells were practicable devices. A number of experiments took place in the next 2 or 3 centuries, including one submarine in which the crew turned a hand crank to propel the vessel mechanically. Jumping now to the 1930s, Two United States explorers, William Beebe and Otis Barton, developed a bathysphere, which means deep sphere, in which they dived to 922 metres. The bathysphere was just large enough for 2 people and was raised and lowered from a ship by a steel cable. Electricity reached it along a power line from the mothership, and the 2 men breathed oxygen from tanks fitted to the interior. They had a telephone link with the ship and were broadcast on the radio all over the USA.
Questions 5 to 9.
Nowadays, we have submersibles that can withstand the immense water pressure far below the surface. One of these deep submergence vehicles, as they're called, is Alvin, which has been in use since 1964. A typical dive lasts 8 hours and descends to 4,500 metres below sea level. Alvin is used for various scientific purposes, including, in 1985 to 86, surveying the wreck of the Titanic, the ocean liner that sank in the Atlantic in 1912. The first thing you notice about Alvin is its bright red sail, displaying the name of the vessel. The sail is on top of the vehicle, at the front, and helps to maintain stability. Alvin is about 7 metres long and just over 3.5 metres high, but only a small portion of that space is available for people. This is in the pressure sphere, which is located under the sail at the front of the vessel. With a diameter of about 2 metres, there's room for 3 people, but it's a tight squeeze. Usually, there's a pilot and 2 scientists. From here, they can look out in various directions through 4 viewing ports. Alvin carries a large number of instruments, including video and still cameras mounted on the exterior at the front, along with lights for illuminating the ocean, as of course sunlight doesn't penetrate this far down. Usually there's a stowage basket mounted on a frame at the front, used to hold tools and scientific equipment. Immediately under the sail is the hatch, which has a diameter of only 50 centimetres. This is the way into the vessel. On top of the sail, there's a current meter to measure the movement of the ocean. Propulsion is provided by 6 electric thrusters, which make Alvin very manoeuvrable. 3 of them are for forward and reverse movement, 2 for vertical motion, and a final thruster, right at the back of the vessel, turns the submersible round. Now we'll turn to other uses.
Test folder 4. Exercise 2. You will hear part of a lecture about the history of European exploration. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 6. Now listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 6.
The explorations by Christopher Columbus and other Europeans during the 15th and 16th centuries showed a subtle difference from earlier journeys. A new element in the ethos of the time was a thirst for glory and recognition of the individual, which joined religion and riches as a major factor in exploration. Regardless of the explorers' motives, those who crossed the oceans were able to navigate much more accurately than before, thanks to the development of the quadrant and other instruments, as well as a better understanding of the functioning of the magnetic compass. This, along with improvements in cartography, made voyages somewhat less dangerous. During the 18th century, there was a renewed emphasis on exploration for scientific purposes, and to improve the stock of information and understanding that was available. European intellectuals became aware of their ignorance about certain aspects of the physical and natural world and were keen to do something about it. Many ocean voyages were on vessels that were basically floating scientific laboratories. They had trained scientists on board, as well as a vast array of equipment, and skilled artists and draftsmen to make accurate records of the voyage. In the 20th century, countries competed to gain prestige. With less and less land to discover and claim, there were races to the North Pole, the South Pole, Everest, the depths of the oceans, the Moon and Mars. The equivalent of exploration in the 21st century often has more to do with overcoming physical challenges than discovering the unknown. Not simply to reach the peak of Everest, but to reach it alone, or without oxygen, or in the shortest possible time. Exploration has turned inwards. Once we explored what is out there. Now we explore the limits of what we can withstand.
Unit 8. Culinary Tools. 8.2. Exercise 2. Questions 1 to 7.
In Europe, knives have been used as weapons, tools and eating utensils since prehistoric times, and spoons are equally ancient. In the early Stone Age, tens of thousands of years ago, it seems that in southern Europe, spoons were made of shells. Evidence for this includes the fact that later the Greek and Latin words for a spoon come from the word for the shell of a snail. In northern Europe, wood was probably the most common material, and again there's linguistic evidence for this. Though forks are much more recent, they trace their origins back over 2,000 years to the ancient Greeks. Their forks had two tines, they're the points that go into the food, and were designed to hold meat steady while it was carved and served. The tines allowed it to slide off easily. By the 7th century, royal courts of the Middle East had begun to use forks at the table for dining. Forks became fairly common among the wealthy in Byzantium, modern Istanbul, and in the 11th century they were introduced into Italy. The Italians, however, were slow to start using them. During the Middle Ages, very roughly from the 9th or 10th century up to and including the 15th, Europeans used knives and their fingers for eating. Hosts didn't provide knives for their guests, and most people carried their own in sheaths attached to their belts. These knives had pointed ends and were used to spear food and raise it to the mouth. Spoons of the Middle Ages were generally made of wood or horn, although royalty often had spoons made of gold and other wealthy families might have silver ones. From about the 14th century, spoons made of brass, pewter and other metals became common. The use of pewter especially made spoons more affordable for ordinary people.
Questions 8 to 14.
By the 16th century, forks were in everyday use in Italy, and in 1533 they were brought from Italy to France when an Italian noblewoman married the future king of France. At first, using them was thought to be pretentious, and they were slow to catch on. In the early 17th century, an Englishman named Thomas Coriate brought the first forks back to England after seeing them in Italy during his travels. The English, however, thought forks unnecessary, treated them with ridicule and continued to use their hands. But slowly forks became fashionable among the wealthy. Small, slender-handled forks with two tines were used for sweet, sticky foods or for food which was likely to stain the fingers. By the middle of the 17th century, forks used solely for dining were luxuries made of expensive materials. They indicated social status and sophistication and were intended to impress guests. Early table forks, like kitchen forks, had two fairly long, widely spaced tines, which ensured that meat wouldn't twist while it was being cut, but small pieces of food fell between the tines. In late 17th century France, larger forks with four tines were developed. Diners were now less likely to drop food, and as the tines were curved, forks served as a scoop, so people didn't have to constantly switch to a spoon while eating. The fact that knives were still used as weapons always posed the threat of danger at the dinner table. However, once forks began to gain popular acceptance, forks being more efficient for spearing food, there was no longer any need for a sharp tip at the end of a dinner knife. In 1669, the King of France declared knives like this illegal on the street or at the dinner table, and he had all knife tips ground down in order to reduce violence. Other design changes followed. Cutlers, who manufactured knives, began to make the blunt ends wider and rounder so that small pieces of food could be piled on the knife and carried to the mouth. The birth of blunt-tipped knives in Europe had a lasting effect on American dining etiquette. At the beginning of the 18th century, very few forks were being imported to America. However, knives were being brought in and their tips became progressively blunter. Because Americans had very few forks and no longer had sharp-tipped knives, they had to use spoons in place of forks. They would use the spoon to steady food as they cut, and then switch the spoon to the opposite hand in order to scoop up food to eat. This style of eating has continued to the present day, though with the fork replacing the spoon. Many Americans cut their food, then lay the knife down and hold only the fork while they eat. During the last 100 years or so, the ornamental styles of cutlery popular in previous centuries have given way to much plainer designs, and stainless steel has replaced many of the materials used earlier. Now there's a whole range of cutlery intended for different purposes in the kitchen or dining room, including different spoons for soup, dessert, tea, coffee, knives for main course, steak, grapefruit, forks for cake, main course, dessert, and the list grows longer as new specialised implements are invented.
Progress Test 2. This test is in the teacher's book. You will hear part of a radio programme. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 5. Now listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 5.
Next on Radio East, your favourite local radio station, we have Emma Thornton with Music News, her weekly update on music events in the region. Emma.
Thanks, Kevin. As usual, I'll start with next week's events. On Monday, remember, we've got the chance to hear amateur rock groups from all over the region competing in Radio East's annual rock contest. Well, demand for tickets is at record levels, so the competition has been moved from the town hall to the recreation centre, as the hall there is larger, so that means you can still buy tickets. Important news for jazz fans now. If you were planning to go to Wednesday evening's jazz concert at Clarkson School, I'm sorry to say that this won't now be taking place. This is because of structural problems that have just been discovered at the school hall, and it hasn't been possible to find an alternative venue at such short notice. Ticket holders should contact the school for further information. On Friday evening, there's a concert at the Town Hall given by the Eastern Counties Symphony Orchestra to celebrate its 25th anniversary. And if you haven't already got tickets, I'm afraid you're going to be disappointed, as there are absolutely none left. It's a shame it isn't being held at the Recreation Centre where there are more seats. Now, last month, a capacity audience enjoyed the 70s night at the Town Hall, with several of the top bands of the 1970s taking part. This gig proved so popular that it's going to be repeated this Saturday at the same venue, so this is a last-minute addition to the week's events. I understand a private function at the Town Hall was cancelled, making it available for the 70s night. Sunday sees an afternoon of folk music from around the world. There's no charge for this event, which is taking place in Riverside Park from 11 until 5. You're advised to arrive early because a lot of people are expected. So that's the music events next week.
Before you hear the next part of the programme, you have some time to look at questions 6 to 10. Now listen and answer questions 6 to 10.
Now I'll go on to events the week after next, starting with Tuesday the 18th, when there's an evening of music from West Africa. This will be held at the Recreation Centre and all tickets cost £8. The usual reduced prices for groups aren't available for this event, I'm afraid, but there are concessions for students. Don't forget, you need to provide proof when you book. The following evening, the 19th, the Stars Touring Opera Company will be performing Bizet's ever-popular Carmen at the Town Hall. If you saw the company when they visited us last year, you'll know they're one of the best opera companies around, and the tickets are a bargain at £5 to £25. There are only a few left though, and the box office manager has asked me to remind you that the box office doesn't take email bookings, and because of staff shortages, they're giving priority to customers who come in person. If you use the phone, they may not be able to answer. And just one more event to mention. On the 21st, there'll be a varied programme of classical and popular songs performed by the Jamestown Singers, a group of talented young professionals from this area. The recital will take place at the university, and this is the first public performance there this autumn. Tickets cost £7 and must be booked in advance. Some of these young singers are likely to be the stars of the future, so it's well worth hearing them now. OK, and that ends this week's music news.
Thank you, Emma.
Unit 9, Old and New. 9.1, Exercises 2 and 3.
Okay, I'm going to talk to you about Venezia, that is to say Venice, which my mother comes from originally. Her parents still live there, but my mom moved away when she met my dad. He's from Puglia, in the south of Italy. We all live in Bari, the main city there. Okay, sorry, now I'm going to describe Venice. What can I say about Venice? It's an old city, and its infrastructure hasn't changed very much in hundreds of years. It's built on water, so instead of roads through the center, you have waterways, canals, and to get around, you can either walk or take a boat. In Venice, there are public vaporetti. Those are the water buses which stop every so often to pick up passengers. And then there are lots of smaller water taxis, private boats, and of course the beautiful gondolas which tourists love to take. I feel very sad about Venice because it's a city that is, how can I put it, it's losing its heart. Yeah, so what I dislike about Venice is this, because so many people have moved away, more and more of the real shops have closed down. By real shops, I mean bakers and other essential food shops. And it's true, every time I go back there, another one has gone. You know, it's really bad. If you walk through any part of Venice, nearly every shop you come across will be selling souvenirs, most of them rather tacky. I hate that. Well, of course, all year massive numbers of tourists visit Venice, and I think it's a terrible problem because the city just becomes like Disneyland. Yeah, it's true. To put it another way, it's not a living city any longer. I know tourists bring money to the city, but they're killing it too in a way. It goes without saying that tourists come to Venice for the history, the buildings, the art. Venice looks so fantastic. Obviously, there are no high-rise buildings, and that makes the city unusual, but the canals make it unique. Most of the buildings in Venice are sinking. Right now, there's a lot of construction work going on to strengthen their foundations. There's terrible subsidence and the whole of Venice is sinking. It's really a big problem.
Thank you.
9.2. Exercise 2.
One of the most important archaeological projects ever undertaken has to be that of the ancient Sumerian city of Ur, because it threw a great deal of light onto the previously dark past and expanded our knowledge in so many areas, from urban planning to the beginnings of writing. These excavations were a joint expedition between the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania, and were led by Leonard Woolley throughout, from 1922 until 1934. From the extensive work of Woolley and his team, it was possible to establish that Ur was the very first city in the world, founded at least 5,500 years ago. Because Ur was strategically located close to the Euphrates River, there's no question that its first settlers would have been self-sufficient. Indeed, it was their development of irrigation and the domestication of animals that allowed a traditionally nomadic people to settle in one place with their livestock, knowing that they could depend on a regular source of food. However, away from the riverbanks, the environment was fairly arid, and as Ur developed, it was no longer possible to grow enough to feed all its citizens. The soil simply wasn't fertile enough to support the level of production that the population required. For this reason, the people turned to trade. The inhabitants of Ur became highly skilled artisans and traded their goods for food and other resources. The most flourishing period of Ur as a city was between 5,000 and 4,400 years ago, when it was an important cultural, religious and commercial centre. It was around 5,000 years ago that mankind's first writing system developed, stemming initially from the need to record the city's stocks of grain accurately. Ur was not the largest city in the region at this time. While 4,700 years ago Ur had a population of 34,000 people, the trading centre of Uruk, situated near the confluence of the Euphrates River and Iturungal Canal, had over 80,000 people and extended over an area of 1,000 acres. Like any trading centre, Uruk had a diverse population and was often referred to as the Rainbow City for this reason. It was actually two cities. There was the newer trading centre, Kulab, on the bank of the Euphrates, and Eana, the religious centre which fronted the Iturungal Canal. From about 4,400 years ago, Ur's power diminished, but it rose again around 4,100 years ago. This started the period known as the Third Dynasty, when Ur-Nammu, the brother of King Utuk-Hagal, established his kingship in Ur and its surroundings. Hardly had the Third Dynasty begun when it was brought to an abrupt end by invaders, who destroyed the city-state and relegated Ur to being a backwater again.
Test folder 5. You will hear part of a lecture about the development of suburbs in the USA. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 6. Now listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 6.
Today we're looking at how the suburbs of cities in the USA have developed since the middle of the 20th century. But first, a little history. Suburbs have existed in various forms since antiquity, when cities typically were walled and the villages outside them were inferior in size and status. However, the modern American notion of the quiet, unspoiled outskirts as a retreat for the wealthy city dweller is in evidence as early as the 6th century BC in Babylon. Further early evidence comes from Cicero, writing in the 1st century BC, who refers to suburbani, large country estates just outside Rome. Throughout Europe, the distinction between the city and outlying districts tended to remain sharp through the Middle Ages and Renaissance. To accommodate a large influx of newcomers, city walls were expanded, or, as with London, towns adjacent to the overcrowded city were gradually annexed to it. Generally considered a less desirable location, the urban periphery was inhabited largely by the poor. In England, the rich who owned weekend villas outside London gradually transferred their main residences there, and the middle class soon followed. By the mid-19th century, there was a marked preference for suburban living. Migration from the central city to the suburbs was encouraged by a succession of technological advances in transportation. Horse-drawn stagecoaches, railways, and the electric streetcar or trolley all enabled urban dwellers to commute longer distances than had previously been practical. Now in Europe, unlike the United States, suburbs grew organically as a response to human needs, and each suburb there generally has a center and often has a quite distinct quality from other suburbs. Since the mid-20th century, however, North America has seen a distinctive pattern of growth called suburban sprawl, an almost endless spread of low-density housing without any distinct neighborhood centers. This is an artificial system, conceived by architects, engineers, and planners, and it's already showing itself to be unsustainable. Unlike the traditional neighborhood, sprawl is not healthy growth. It's essentially self-destructive. It consumes land at an alarming rate while producing insurmountable traffic problems. As the ring of suburbia grows around most North American cities, so the void at the center grows too. Business and people move to fresher locations on a new suburban edge, leaving behind deteriorating downtown neighborhoods, which can only be revitalized with enormous effort. Suburban sprawl came about as the direct result of a number of U.S. federal policies. The most significant were the housing and loan programs, which, from the 1940s, provided mortgages to encourage home purchase. These mortgages were directed at new single-family suburban construction, discouraging the renovation of existing housing stock and the construction of higher-density housing. Simultaneously, a major highway program, coupled with the neglect of mass transit, helped make automotive commuting affordable and convenient for the average citizen.
Before you hear the rest of the lecture, you have some time to look at questions 7 to 11. Now listen and answer questions 7 to 11.
Suburban sprawl actually tends to be very simple, consisting of just a few components which are normally kept strictly segregated from each other. One component is housing subdivisions, which are districts consisting only of residences. They are sometimes called villages, towns, or neighborhoods by their developers, which is misleading, since those terms denote places which are not exclusively residential and which provide a richness of experience that is not available in a housing tract. Subdivisions can be identified as such by their contrived names, which tend toward the romantic and often pay tribute to the natural or historic resource they have displaced, woodland, mills, or ponds maybe, that have been destroyed. Another element, schools, have evolved dramatically in the past 30 or 40 years. A comparison between the size of the car park and the size of the building is revealing. Most are schools to which no child will ever walk. Pedestrian access is usually non-existent, and the spread of homes often makes school buses impractical, so the designs of schools in the new suburbs assume massive automotive transportation. Other components, too, such as shopping areas and business parks, have their own separate locations. As a result, one of the most conspicuous components of sprawl consists of the endless roadways that are necessary to connect all these elements. Since each section of suburbia serves only one type of activity, And since daily life involves a wide variety of activities, the residents of suburbia spend an unprecedented amount of time and money moving from one place to the next. And as most of this motion takes place in singly occupied automobiles, even a sparsely populated area can generate the traffic of a much larger traditional town. Now I'm going to examine the role.
Unit 10. In Your Dreams. 10.2. Exercise 2. Questions 1 to 4.
Right, first of all, let's do a quick practical activity together. As you know, metaphor and symbols are important in the interpretation of dreams. Both Jung and Freud referred to symbolization in their analysis. Now, there's not necessarily one right answer. These pictures are meant to act as a springboard for your own interpretations. So I'd like you to take turns to talk about a picture and suggest what each might represent in a dream. OK?
Fine. Shall I start?
Go for it, Carla.
Right, with this one, I know Jung saw the sea as representing the unconscious. So perhaps something living in water like this exists in the unconscious. As it can move, it could be an insight or a new idea.
Well done. OK, Jason.
I had a dream a bit like this one. I was following behind a group, trying to keep up. I remember feeling rather anxious about that. I guess it could represent today's competitive world, or moving forward along life's path. Growing older, maybe. What's really interesting is that my dream had the same burnt colours as this. Well, enough about me. Helen, your turn.
OK. This one is classic Jung, isn't it? A larger-than-life character who might be seen as threatening because of his size. It might be some kind of problem that you have to deal with, a big one that you're really concerned about.
He couldn't be seen as friendly, could he?
Protective? Maybe. No, I don't think so. Are you going to do one too?
All right. Well, here we have another classic symbol, don't we? The image has actually been used in the dream sequences of films by Bergman and Pasolini, two great directors. In both films, there were no hands, maybe suggesting that time had run out. So this one must be all about limits, pressure of deadlines, appointments, that sort of thing.
Questions 5 to 7.
OK, can you get out your notes about the case studies now? Helen, can you start? Summarise the dream and give us your interpretation. And please challenge each other's views. Raise your own ideas.
Right, this dream is about climbing. A small group of people is trying to reach the top of a mountain. They're nearly at the summit, but the dreamer gets separated from the others when the mist comes down. He stumbles around for a bit and then goes back down to the bottom where the sun comes out, and he finds himself in the middle of a field of enormous white flowers.
Happy ending then?
Not so sure. As I see it, getting split up from the rest of the party could be seen as exclusion, but it's his own decision to retrace his steps, isn't it? Then he's surrounded by the flowers, which could mean that there's pressure on him to conform, but I think he rejects that.
Yeah, but the flower is basically a thing of beauty, a positive symbol. I think he's back in a comfort zone.
OK. Thanks, Helen. Carla, let's hear yours next.
Well, it's the face in the mirror dream. A woman looks into a mirror and sees a different face staring back at her. She's youthful and confident, but it's not a younger version of herself, it's another person. She starts rubbing at the glass and the face is still there, laughing now. This is a crisis of identity. The dreamer may have experienced some problems recently, or could be full of regrets about her own life. The face in the mirror is young and happy. This could represent envy of others, perhaps.
And you all agree with that?
Well, mightn't it be something to do with a dual life? You know, presenting a different, more outgoing face to the outside world.
Good. OK, Jason, let's hear you now.
I'm afraid I haven't done it.
Typical.
Unit 11. The Physical World. 11.1. Exercise 2. Questions 1 to 5.
Today, I'm going to talk about two natural features of the English coast, Spurn Head and Chesil Beach. First, an explanation. A long, narrow accumulation of sand and or stones, with one end joining the mainland, is called a spit, and Spurn Head is a good example of one. Spits are often created in sheltered areas where the waves aren't usually strong enough to wash the sand away, or where erosion further along the coast provides plenty of material. If you look at the sketch map, you'll see how a spit is typically formed. In this example, the prevailing winds blow from the southwest, creating a current flowing along the shore, known as longshore drift. In this case, it's moving roughly eastwards. The current carries sand or other material along the coast. At the turn in the coastline, the headland, larger stones are piled up on the seabed in the sheltered water immediately to the east of it. This forms the beginning of the spit. As more and more stones and sand accumulate, the feature is extended eastwards. The wind tends to pick up sand from the beach as it dries out and carry it to the sheltered side of the spit to form dunes. These are stabilised as grasses begin to take root. Gentle, low-energy waves entering the sheltered area behind the spit deposit fine mud, creating an increasingly shallow area of salt marsh. This is regularly flooded by the tide, and large amounts of vegetation grow there. The marsh slowly fills the area of shallow sea that is now largely surrounded by the spit and the original coastline, which in this diagram lies to the north of the new spit. Spits often form close to where a river widens into an estuary as it approaches the sea. However, the spit won't extend across the estuary if the river is too deep, or if the current of the river is strong enough to wash away any material deposited by longshore drift.
Questions 6 to 10.
Now I'll go on to Spurn Head, which is a spit on the east coast of England. It's about 5 kilometres long, with the North Sea to the east and the River Humber to the west and south, where the Humber reaches the sea. Spurn Head consists of sand that has come from the soft land to the northwest. The sea removes about 6 million tonnes of material from the cliffs each year, making them retreat 1 to 2 metres. This rapid erosion provides plenty of material for the spit. Longshore drift transports it southwards to Spurn Head and deposits it there. Records of the last 1,000 years show that the spit goes through a cycle of creation and destruction roughly every 250 years. What happens is that as well as bringing material from further north, the sea moves sand along the peninsula towards the tip. This narrows the neck and in time the sea breaches it. The tip is now isolated and is washed away, and then a new spit begins to take shape. The present spit is nearing the end of the cycle, and its narrowest point, which is only 50 metres wide, is in continual danger of being breached.
Questions 11 to 15.
Now, let's look at another example of a spit. A striking feature of the south coast of England is Chesil Beach, which is almost 30 kilometres long and never more than 200 metres wide. It links the Isle of Portland to the mainland. The beach probably began to develop 10 or 12,000 years ago, but the way it formed is uncertain. It consists of stones that are graduated in size. At the Portland end, they're as large as a large potato, while those at the opposite end are much finer, no bigger than a pea. The beach has created a shallow lagoon for much of its length, where it protects the river Fleet against the sea. The lagoon is rich in marine wildlife and birds. The Isle of Portland itself is made of limestone, and footprints of dinosaurs have been found in it. A great many London buildings, including St. Paul's Cathedral, are made of Portland stone. Stone has been quarried for hundreds of years, but it was first mined in 2002 in the west of the island, not far from Chesil Beach. In places, the stone is above a softer material, which the sea is eroding. This has led to the formation of some collapsed caves along the southeast coast of the island, close to the southern tip. A harbour has been constructed by enclosing the bay between the mainland and the Isle of Portland, with Chesil Beach forming its western boundary.
Test folder 6. You will hear a hotel owner describing some interesting walks to a guest in the hotel. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 7. Now listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 7.
Is this your first visit to the area?
Yes. I'm planning to do a lot of walking while I'm here. Are there any walks you'd recommend?
Oh, it's very nice for walking around here. If you turn right out of the door of the guest house and follow the road, it'll take you to the lighthouse. You can't miss it. It's close to the road, right on the headland. There's a footpath near it, just before the road turns left. You should go along the path to the edge of the cliffs, down the steps and turn left. So you're going back along the beach towards the headland and, if you're lucky, you might find some fossils at the bottom of the cliffs.
Do many people find them?
Well, not so many these days, to be honest, but you never know.
I read that there are some caves in the cliffs as well.
That's right, but you'll have to go south along the beach for those. They're at the nearest part of the cliffs to where we are, just where the land starts curving round. But they get cut off by the tide, so be very careful.
Yes, I will be.
Another nice walk is on the north side of the estuary. If you turn left from here and go along the road as far as the crossroads, instead of continuing along the road, take the footpath that runs parallel with it. That'll take you across the river. Then you can turn right onto another path. The stream is very shallow and there are stepping stones across it, so you'll be able to cross without much trouble. Then you'll come to the salt marsh. Keep to the riverbank, or you might have difficulty walking. Beyond that, there are sand dunes and a beach, and the islands just offshore.
Is it possible to row to the islands?
Yes, there's a place to hire boats in the village. Visitors aren't allowed to land on the island that's furthest from the shore, so as not to disturb the birds, but you can go to the others. In fact, they get plenty of birds too. The southernmost island is covered with wild flowers at this time of year. And there are the remains of an ancient fortress on the island that's right in the estuary.
OK. Well, thanks very much. I'll go out for a couple of hours now.
Enjoy yourself, and I'll see you later.
Unit 12. Nature or Nurture. 12.2. Exercise 2. Questions 1 to 7.
The more we discover about the behaviour of birds, the more impressive it seems. But do they learn what to do, or is it somehow in their genes? Here in the studio is animal behaviour specialist Jenny Johnson to tell us. Jenny.
Thank you. Much of what birds know is innate or instinctive, programmed into their genes. They're born knowing how to identify food, and remember that what one species eats may be poisonous to another, so it's important to get it right. In the spring, when the days grow longer, the increased light alters hormone levels in birds' blood, triggering several essential changes in behaviour. For one thing, the alteration makes them migrate at the right time, so that they reach their nesting sites at the right time for the next stage in their life cycle. They're also programmed to build nests, with different species producing very different styles of nests. So these are things that birds are programmed to do at certain times.
And what about the sounds that different species of birds make? Are they also innate?
Yes and no. Some species are genetically programmed to produce particular sounds and don't need to learn them. Every dove coos, even if it doesn't hear other doves doing it. The same is true of nearly all birds' hunger and danger signals, which are among the 20 or so simple calls that are used to communicate certain messages.
Does this apply to birdsong too?
Birdsong seems to be a combination of genetic programming and learning. Some species are born with the ability to learn to sing, but not with the song itself, so it's different from cooing. Normally a chick, that's a young bird, hears the songs of lots of species while it's growing up, but the chick always picks out and learns the correct song for its own species. That's what it's been programmed to do. But if a bird is reared in isolation so that it doesn't hear other birds of any species, the song it sings will be a rudimentary version of the normal song. The programming isn't enough for it to sing the song in full. And interestingly, if a chick is brought up among birds of a different species, it learns their song, even if it can hear its own species singing around it.
Questions 8 to 12.
Do we know anything about the learning process?
Well, one bird that's been studied a great deal is the zebra finch, a small, colourful bird that originates in Australia and has black and white stripes on its tail, like a zebra. Just as we have to hear language when we're babies in order to learn to speak, zebra finches need to hear song early in life to be able to produce it. To become fluent in their song, they also need to practice it repeatedly. And in fact, one study found evidence that they practice in their sleep. Electrical brain activity goes on, which is similar to the brain activity when they're awake and singing.
That sounds like an efficient use of their time. Is there any time limit on when a bird can learn to sing?
Normally, a male zebra finch develops a version of the adult song when it's at least 20 days old and will have more or less learned the song by the age of 35 days. Practicing it means that it masters the song by around 60 days, and if it hasn't heard any zebra finches singing by then, it won't learn the song at all. After the age of 90 days, when the bird is fully mature, its song won't change.
And do all individual birds of the same species sing exactly the same song?
No, they don't. For some species, small differences can develop which over generations become different dialects, just as with human languages. This is often the case with birds that imitate others. Marsh warblers, for instance, spend the winter in Africa and can mimic the calls of over 70 bird species. These will be other birds living in the same region, so each male warbler's song indicates which part of Africa he winters in. A few species, like starlings and miners, imitate sounds that aren't birdsong and incorporate them into their own individual songs. Some starlings have been known to mimic sheep. In Oxford, they mimic buses. But the Australian lyrebird seems to be the bird world's best mimic. It can imitate 12 other birds, car engines, car alarms, even chainsaws cutting down trees.
Jenny, thank you.
Thank you.
Progress Test 3. This test is in the teacher's book. You will hear 2 students discussing a project they're going to write. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 6. Now listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 6.
Hi, Ben. Glad you could come round.
Hello, Sharon.
Have a seat.
All right.
Now, we need to plan our project on the history of this town. I thought we could start by making a list of what needs to be done and divide the jobs between us.
OK. Well, the first thing is to decide what exactly we're trying to do. Shall we do that together?
Well, we could, but we've already talked about it and got a rough idea. Why don't you draw up a detailed description and then I can have a look at it?
OK, I'll do that.
Right. Then we'll need to find out what's already known about the town. I'd quite like to use the internet for research.
OK, though I know some good websites on local history. Maybe we could divide it between us.
Fine, that'll save time. Then there are some local documents in the public library. What do you think?
Well, a friend of mine is a librarian there, and I'm sure he'd help. So it'll probably be easier if I do it.
Good, I was hoping you'd say that. Then the other type of research we talked about was interviewing elderly people who've lived here all their lives.
Yes, the oral history aspect of the project. Do you reckon we should structure the interviews or not?
Maybe we should plan a few questions to start off, then just follow up what people say. Shall I think of some questions?
OK. Better wait till we've done the library and internet research.
Yes, you're probably right. And of course we need to find people willing to be interviewed.
Right. I'm not really sure how to go about it.
I was thinking about contacting local organisations for elderly people, like retirement homes and day centres, explaining what we're doing and asking if they know anyone who's lived here for 60 years or more.
There must be a lot of organisations to contact. Shall I take on half of them?
All right. I'll make a list and mark which ones we should each contact, OK?
Fine. We'll need to have copies of old maps of the town, won't we? I could look for those if you like.
Why not go to the records office? They're bound to have some there. And I can also look while I'm doing research.
Sounds good.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 7 to 10. Now listen and answer questions 7 to 10.
Now, we need to know what buildings were here 70 or 80 years ago, don't we?
Yes. So many old buildings were knocked down in the 1950s and 60s to make room for new ones. It's such a shame.
Now, there was a 19th century school somewhere, wasn't there?
If you cross the river, turn left into South Street and continue along the road until just after it curves round, the school was on the left.
Oh, I know where you mean. Then there's the old prison. You know where that was, don't you?
No.
One of the windows still exists, with bars across it, as part of a shop. It's on the bend in the high street where it meets the market square.
OK. Well, then there's the George, an old coaching inn where coaches used to stop in the days before railways existed.
Where was that?
The entrance was in South Street, and the building occupied the corner of the high street.
And someone mentioned some warehouses that I'd never heard of.
Warehouses?
Yes, they were quite close to the high street on the opposite side from South Street. They were used by merchants transporting goods by boat, so they're close to the river.
Well, I never knew that. Right, the next thing we need to...
Unit 13. Cosmic Debris. 13.2. Exercise 2.
OK, everyone, let's start. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the European Space Agency mission Rosetta, more popularly known as the Comet Chaser. The aim of the mission is to orbit and eventually land on a small comet in our solar system. This is something that clearly has never been done before. Actually, the ESA had a bit of bad luck. Rosetta was originally going to be launched in 2003, but the mission had to be postponed due to a malfunction of the launch rocket. This in turn meant that the ESA had to find another comet, because the one they first chose, called 46P Wirtanen, will have travelled far beyond Rosetta's flight path by now. Rosetta was launched on the 2nd of March 2004 and will be tracking a comet known as Churyumov-Gerasimenko. Let's call it CG for short during this lecture. Under the revised flight plan, Rosetta will make 1 flyby of Mars and 3 of the Earth before heading for CG. This circuitous route will enable Rosetta to make 2 excursions into the main asteroid belt before its rendezvous with our fast-moving cosmic iceberg in August 2014. Rosetta will slow down and go into orbit around CG, and from an altitude of just a few kilometres, its cameras will be able to map the entire surface of the comet at high resolution. This mapping exercise will enable a safe landing site to be selected, and once this has been done, the Rosetta lander will separate from the orbiter and slowly descend to the icy surface. If everything goes according to plan, the lander will anchor itself to CG's crust and begin a detailed survey of its surroundings. Over a period of several weeks, data from the 9 instruments on the lander will be sent back to Earth via the Rosetta orbiter. The lander will dispatch close-up pictures of the comet's nucleus, drill into the dark organic crust, and sample the primordial ices and gases. Meanwhile, the orbiter will have been transmitting radio signals through the nucleus to the lander in order to analyse the internal structure of the comet. The orbiter will monitor the changes that take place in the comet as it hurtles on its way towards our Sun. As the comet is increasingly warmed, bright jets will appear, creating distinctive tails as gas and dust are ejected into space. In fact, CG is probably a much better choice of comet than the original one, in that it typically becomes much more active than Wirtanen does as it approaches the Sun. Scientists certainly won't get bored studying this comet. The enormous amount of data that will be returned during Rosetta's voyage is likely to change our understanding of comets fundamentally. In addition, it will provide new insights into such basic mysteries as the formation of our oceans and even the origins of life. Thirdly, it is expected that Rosetta will give scientists vital insights about how to respond should there ever be a comet on a collision course with our planet. OK, so that's the Rosetta mission, which will terminate in December 2015. Try to find out more about it over the next few weeks. Why not check out the official website,
13.2 Exercise 4 1.
Actually, the ESA had a bit of bad luck.
2.
Scientists certainly won't get bored studying this comet.
3.
The aim of the mission is to orbit and eventually land on a small comet in our solar system.
4.
The enormous amount of data that will be returned during Rosetta's voyage is likely to change our understanding of comets fundamentally.
5.
As the comet is increasingly warmed, bright jets will appear.
6.
Rosetta was originally going to be launched in 2003.
7.
It typically becomes much more active than Wirtanen does as it approaches the Sun.
13.2 Exercise 5 1.
I actually know one of the scientists working on the Rosetta mission.
2.
The launch was planned for 2003 originally.
3.
It eventually took place a year later.
4.
Typically, comets develop bright tails as they get nearer the sun.
5.
Scientists will certainly be given a lot of data by the end of the mission.
Test folder 7. You will hear part of a lecture about meteorites and about some craters they have created on Earth. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 6. Now listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 6.
For thousands of years, people have been fascinated by streaks of light flashing across the night sky. These shooting stars are actually tiny grains of dust from space that burn up in Earth's atmosphere before reaching the ground. But hundreds of times a year, a rock called a meteorite survives the fiery trip from space and lands on Earth. The vast majority are pieces of asteroids, the small rocky bodies that orbit the Sun. One November morning in 1492, a young boy saw a large stone plummet from the sky and land near the town of Ensisheim in Alsace, France. This fall is the earliest one witnessed in the Western world, from which meteorite samples have been preserved. Immediately after it fell, people began chipping off pieces as souvenirs, and fragments of the Ensisheim meteorite can be found in museum collections all over the world. When the Krasnoyarsk meteorite was found in 1749, no one believed that rocks came from space. But a German physicist analysed this meteorite's unusual mixture of stone and iron and began to convince skeptics that meteorites did indeed originate far from Earth. Antarctica is an ideal place to find meteorites because the dark specimens are easy to see against the snow and ice. As the ice sheets move, they push older ice to the surface. Powerful winds remove the ice, exposing the meteorites buried underneath. The largest meteorite on display in any museum is a 34-ton piece of iron that's just part of a much larger meteorite called Cape York. This landed in Greenland thousands of years ago, before any people lived there. Cape York originally weighed around 200 tons before it broke apart in the atmosphere. In 1947, people in eastern Siberia saw a huge fireball that exploded as it streaked across the sky, bursting into tens of thousands of fragments that made cracking and roaring noises as they fell to Earth. These iron fragments crashed into thick woodland, tearing apart and uprooting many of the trees and creating thousands of craters. Although countless meteorites have crashed onto the planet, most of the craters that they left have been erased or hidden by natural forces. Only about 200 meteorite impact craters have been found, of various sizes. Vredefort crater in South Africa is a ring of mountains with a diameter of 300 kilometres, which seems to be a record. One of Earth's largest intact meteorite craters, Wolf Creek crater, was long known only to the local population of native Australians. Their legend describes a rainbow snake that emerged from the crater and formed a nearby watercourse as it slithered away. In 1947, oil company geologists spotted the stunning crater during an airplane survey of some of Australia's most remote desert. Now, let's consider what we can learn from meteorites. It seems to me...
Unit 14. Trends in Society. 14.1. Exercise 9.
OK, Let's continue our discussion of changes in society. Can you explain why the birth rate is falling in many countries?
Well, of course I'm not an expert, but there are probably several reasons for this decline. Often both people in a relationship are working, so it's hard for them to bring up large families. They are choosing not to, in other words. Also, I read somewhere that there may be an environmental issue, that pollution is causing couples to be less fertile. I think that's a real possibility.
And what impact does an ageing population have on society?
It has many implications. First, older people usually need more support. I don't just mean healthcare, but also social support, like entertainment, to give them a better quality of life, to stop them feeling lonely. Secondly, because there are fewer younger people working and paying taxes, it means that there is a question mark over resources, how much the state can provide.
Do you think the state should provide completely free care for the elderly?
Yes, I do, in theory. But as I said earlier, in practice, there may be not enough money to do that. People are going to have to save for their old age, I guess.
And in the future, will working people have to retire at a later age than they currently do?
I suppose so, yes. Actually, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I mean, if you want to go on working, you're healthy, and your brain is still sharp, you have a lot to offer, all that experience and knowledge.
And more generally, what can young people learn from their grandparents and great-grandparents?
Oh, many things. Sometimes we complain that old people don't understand us, but they have seen a lot, experienced many different things, so they can give us advice on life. And speaking personally, my grandmother is a really good listener too. I talk to her about many things I wouldn't ever discuss with my parents.
Why are people generally living longer nowadays, in your opinion?
It must be down to healthcare, good hospitals, and a better diet as well. That's crucial, what you eat.
Thank you.
14.2 Exercise 2 Questions 1 to 5.
In this course, we'll be looking at some of the causes of social change around the world, and we'll have 1 or 2 examples of each. In this brief introduction, though, I'll use the UK to illustrate some of the great variety of changes that occur. Social change may come about as a result of physical conditions, such as drought, flooding, or crop failure. The Irish potato famine of the 1840s led vast numbers of individuals and whole families to emigrate from rural areas of Ireland to cities, particularly in Britain and the USA. As is usually the case, those who went away were the most active and ambitious, and by losing those people, many rural Irish communities subsequently stagnated. Immigrants usually make a massive contribution to the culture of the receiving country, and Britain has benefited a great deal from this over the centuries. Some groups, like the French Protestants of the 17th century, have become assimilated into the dominant culture. It's too early to predict the long-term effects of some recent waves of immigration to Britain, although newcomers from some parts of Asia, particularly China, Vietnam, India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, have had a remarkable impact on national eating habits in the UK. Contact with other communities doesn't only come about through immigration. As a result of the massive increase in air travel in recent years, many people have adopted customs that they first encountered abroad, such as drinking wine or sitting in pavement cafes. This reflects a change from previous generations, who knew little of behaviour outside their immediate neighbourhood, let alone in other countries. Political factors can lead to considerable social change, and probably the most significant for Britain was the First World War of 1914 to 18. This did a great deal to allow women to catch up with men in terms of political power, job opportunities and individual freedom.
Questions 6 to 10.
Britain has had a fair degree of political stability for several hundred years. As a result, political factors have played a relatively minor role in social change, compared with many other countries, and economic factors have been far more important. I now want to look briefly at how economic factors influenced one major change, the movement of millions of people from the countryside into urban areas during the late 18th century and throughout the 19th. New methods of production meant that, for the first time, most items were manufactured in big factories, instead of in people's homes, and these required a large number of workers living nearby. Remember, there was little public transport and no cars. However, the massive expansion of cities in the 19th century brought with it many problems, including poor health, road congestion, and substandard housing. Just to give you an idea of how one change can lead to a succession of others, the need for a better educated workforce resulted in education becoming compulsory in the late 19th century. This was a factor in weakening the ties of extended families and the wider community and establishing the nuclear family, that is, one consisting of husband, wife and children, as the main operating unit of society. And, as a consequence, the roles of husband and wife changed quite significantly. At the beginning of the 19th century, only a quarter of the population of Britain lived in urban areas. By the 1970s, that figure had become 3/4. Since then, though, the flow into towns has to some extent been reversed, with many people moving from urban to rural areas. Unlike traditional village dwellers, though, a lot of the new residents work in towns, and almost all of them depend on towns for their shopping, education and entertainment. This has obviously had an impact on social structure and life in villages, which I'll come back to later. Although towns have often been blamed for having an alienating effect on their residents, this certainly isn't always the case. Most big towns contain urban villages, that is, small areas with a settled community linked in a network of relationships. Many urban villages used to exist in areas of poor housing and were destroyed by slum clearance programs in which people were moved to new housing estates at a distance. But now there's evidence of urban villages in both poor and more affluent areas. Now let's turn to the
15.1. Exercise 7.
Could you describe any risks that you take in your hobbies?
Yes. I've got a passion for potholing, which means climbing down into underground caves and trying to make your way through them. There's always a risk of losing your balance and falling, or even of getting lost, if you explore a cave system that you're not familiar with.
Could you describe any risks that you take in your hobbies?
Yes. I've got a passion for potholing, which means climbing down into underground caves and trying to make your way through them. There's always a risk of losing your balance and falling, or even of getting lost, if you explore a cave system that you're not familiar with.
15.2. Exercise 2.
OK, thank you all for your suggestions for the study days on philosophy at the end of the month. These are the ones I've chosen for the 6 sessions. We'll tackle 3 topics on each day. On the first day, which is a Thursday, we'll start with language and the question of whether speakers of different languages see the world in different ways. I'll spend the first half hour giving you an overview of the main theories, and then we'll divide into discussion groups. Next, there'll be time for you to consider the law. To be more specific, the question, is it ever right to break the law? For this, could you form yourselves into teams of 4 or 5? I'll give each team a different case study. Then you can go off anywhere you like for an hour to discuss the case without any interference from me. I'd like you to plan a short presentation on it, which you'll give when we all come together afterwards. Also for Thursday, I've chosen political ideologies, considered from a philosophical point of view. Professor Robertson has agreed to produce a handout summarising his views, which I'd like you to read in advance, so we'll have a starting point for discussion. Several of you are interested in the application of philosophy to medicine, so on Friday we'll begin with a session on what it means when doctors say they know the cause of an illness. Susan Harris of the School of Medicine will put forward her views on this, and after she's finished she'll give you a handout of questions to discuss in small groups. Then we'll go on to the question, what is time? Barry Clark, one of our PhD students, will give an introduction to this rather heavyweight subject. He'll have to leave immediately afterwards, so we won't have any discussion or questions until after he's gone, when I'll take over from Barry. And we'll end on a perhaps slightly lighter note with a look at the philosophy of coincidence. No lecture for this. You'll need to think in advance about what coincidences are, and I'll begin the discussion by asking some of you to put forward your ideas. I'll give you a couple of references so you can read up on the topic beforehand.
15.2 Exercise 5.
OK, now we've been considering some of the factors that affect how we understand and interpret the world around us. And today we're going to look at coincidences. Could someone come up with a definition?
It's when 2 or more similar things happen at around the same time and seem to be connected, but there isn't any obvious explanation.
And people think it's surprising or significant.
OK, that'll do to start. Let's have a few examples.
There's the birthday coincidence.
Uh-huh.
Well, if you have a class of 20 or 30 children, people are amazed if 2 of them have the same birthday.
And how significant is it if that happens?
Not at all, because with only 23 children, there's a 1 in 2 chance that any 2 of them will share a birthday.
Most people think you need a far larger number of children.
Of course, it's far less likely that 2 particular children will have the same birthday, or that any 2 will share a particular birthday.
Right. Another example?
What about people who correctly predict the result of a football match for 5 consecutive weeks to try to persuade you to buy the computer program they claim to be using?
That's impressive.
And their predictions are correct.
They certainly are.
Then they've probably also sent out other predictions, which were wrong.
Exactly. They start by writing to a number of people and divide them into 3 groups. They tell one group that one team will win, tell another group that the other team will win, and tell the third group that the result will be a draw. The second week, they only write to the people who'd received the correct prediction and again divide them into 3 groups, and so on, for 5 weeks. The people who receive all 5 correct forecasts are very impressed, of course, but they don't know that for every person who gets 5 correct predictions, 242 don't.
It seems very impressive when you only know part of what's happened.
Then there are the apparent coincidences in fortune-telling or astrology.
Go on.
Well, astrologers describe someone's personality when they don't know the person, only the pattern of stars when they were born. Lots of people believe them, but they generally forget about the statements that aren't true and only remember the ones that are.
So in this case, people are selecting evidence and seeing a pattern which doesn't exist.
Yes, which we often do.
And sometimes people may miss a pattern that really does exist. For instance, the higher the number of ice creams that are sold, the more attacks there are by sharks on people swimming in the sea. It's not that sharks get more dangerous because people are eating ice cream. The reason is that a rise in hot weather has led to both.
Yes, then there's the interesting case of a woman who won an American lottery twice within 4 months.
Gosh.
Lucky woman.
How likely do you think that is?
Must be one chance in millions.
According to some of the early newspaper reports, the chances of such a coincidence happening were 1 in 17 trillion. But then 2 statisticians at Harvard University calculated that with millions of people regularly buying lottery tickets in America, the odds of such an event happening to someone somewhere were only about 1 in 30. Not that amazing after all.
Oh,
That's unbelievable.
no, that can't be right.
Unit 16. The Human Mind. 16.2. Exercise 2.
Recognition is one of the mind's most vital skills, and we use it daily in everything from the simplest to the most complex of tasks. And at the moment when we recognize something, electrical activity takes place inside our brains. Our faculty for recognition can break down, however. Someone suffering the brain disorder agnosia will look at an item, a cup perhaps, and have no idea what it is. Agnosia tends to be very specific. One sufferer may be unable to recognize faces, while another has difficulty with man-made objects. Such disorders can result from localized damage to a specific area in the brain, suggesting that we use different parts of it to store items of different kinds. This would explain the variation in the symptoms of agnosia. It appears, in fact, that the brain stores and categorizes things not according to their appearance or function, but by our individual relationship with them. A musical instrument, such as a trombone, can be seen, felt, played, or heard. Each quality of an item seems to be stored in a separate region of the brain, in what are sometimes called recognition units. So, a musical instrument would have several units. Its shape would be remembered in our visual areas, the word in our vocabulary area, touch in the touch area, and its sound in our hearing area. Someone who has never touched a trombone, though, wouldn't have a touch recognition unit. Each region of the brain may contain the recognition units of objects that seem very different, but they're together because they share the particular quality that concerns that region. So, our trombone might sit in the same bit of the brain as a drinking straw, or a pencil if we suck them, because they're all non-food items that we put in our mouths. When we think of a trombone, all of our separate trombone recognition units are drawn together from their separate storage regions and united to give us what we recognize as a trombone. So it seems that our own individual experiences create the geography of our brains, and that in turn affects our behaviour. Faces occupy a special category of our recognition faculties, and brain scans show heightened activity in these areas not only when we see faces, but even when we imagine seeing them. One reason is that humans are social animals. We live as we've always lived, in groups, and our survival depends on our ability to communicate with others of our own species. So we've evolved with special brain wiring for face recognition. Even a newborn baby will orientate itself towards objects that resemble faces, like a balloon with eyes, nose and mouth drawn on it. Why is it that we forget one person's face, yet remember another, even though neither face might be particularly striking? The recognition unit of a face stays active if we have seen or imagined that person frequently, but this doesn't necessarily require a strong stimulus. That person may stay in our memory if we often see someone else who resembles them. But if we neither see nor think about a person for a long time, the facial recognition unit we have for them falls into disuse, and we may not recognize them if we see them again. Our reactions to faces involve strong emotions. When we meet someone for the first time, we may decide, without any evidence, that they look trustworthy perhaps, or threatening. This irrational response happens because when we see someone, we check whether or not we know them. And this activity uses two pathways within the brain, one conscious, the other unconscious. Through the latter, we can relive an emotional reaction we have had to someone who merely looks slightly like the person we are meeting for the first time. The conscious pathway works more slowly and enables us to work out, for instance, whose face we're looking at and how we should behave towards them. The unconscious pathway is faster and goes through one of the brain's centres of emotion. If we meet a person whose face slightly resembles someone we feared and hated in the past, for example, we briefly experience again our feelings towards that original figure. It's this emotional memory that gives us an almost instantaneous first impression of the person we're meeting.
Progress Test 4. This test is in the teacher's book. You will hear part of a lecture about questions in the study of philosophy. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 6. Now listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 6.
Every day we ask questions and rarely think about the ways in which they differ. But asking the wrong type of question can lead to misunderstanding in daily life and has caused many problems in philosophy. So let me start by talking about some different types of question. Consider the question, how big is your car? I might want to know how many passengers you can take, whether you can park in the space that's available, or how much fuel it uses. So, before you can answer adequately, you need to know my purpose in asking the question. In everyday life, we ask many factual questions about the world around us. For instance, why won't my computer start? And we can answer these questions from experience. Maybe the answer is, there's a power cut. It may be possible to answer factual questions in principle, but not in practice. If I ask, what's the population of Canada at this precise moment, it can be answered in principle. That is, there is a precise answer, but it's highly unlikely that anyone will ever know what it is. So the question can't be answered in practice. Questions may appear to be factual, but aren't. If you and I both know that Jenny Jones is 1.75 meters tall, and I ask, is Jenny Jones tall? I'm asking whether the word tall is normally used in such a situation. In other words, this is a verbal question, not a factual one about Jenny's height. In some cases, verbal questions have serious consequences. Imagine that Billy Smith is on trial in a court of law, and both sides agree about the facts of what happened. The dispute is about how to answer the question, was Billy Smith's action legal? This isn't simply a question about the use of the word legal because it gives instructions. In effect, legal means set him free, and illegal might mean send him to prison. Legality is decided according to certain criteria, but there's much less agreement over the criteria when deciding if something is right. If I ask, was Billy Smith's action right? One person may say yes and another no, and unless I know what criteria they're each using, their answers are of no value to me.
Before you hear the next part of the lecture, you have some time to look at questions 7 to 10. Now listen and answer questions 7 to 10.
I'll now mention some ways in which questions can reflect the speaker's assumptions, that is, beliefs that are taken as being true without thinking. The way a question is phrased can show that the questioner assumes something is true and expects others to agree. This is often the case with questions about someone's opinion, such as, "Don't you think that's a beautiful painting?" A leading question like this makes it clear what answer is wanted. Sometimes, efforts to answer a question are wasted because the assumptions behind a question are false. For years, economists assumed that objects had a real value and attempted to define it. But they were wrong. Value is relative. It can mean how important the object is to different people, or the price the object will sell for, which will vary depending on the time and place. Economists were asking the wrong question. We often build into questions the false assumption that there's only one answer. What's the right way of doing this? But whether it's about bringing up children or playing chess, there can be many answers, and they're likely to be simply a matter of opinion. So the value of the answer depends on what you think of the person giving the answer. If we ask whether a country or a company is friendly, generous, or aggressive, it isn't at all clear what's meant by the country. Is it the present government, most inhabitants, or what? Or what's meant by the description, nor is it clear how it could be measured. We're making the very questionable assumption that personal qualities can be applied to groups of people in just the same way as they can be applied to individuals. Now I'll turn to another subject.
Unit 17. Migration. 17.2. Exercise 2.
Okay, the photo I'm showing you now is of a group of factory workers in Guelph. It was taken in 1933, when migrants were still coming over from Italy to Canada in search of work. Of course, this movement stopped altogether in 1939 with the onset of war. In order to understand why Italians came to Canada, you need to understand why they left Italy. In the late 19th century, Italy was divided into three regions: the north, the south, and a central region which included the capital, Rome, and the Vatican. The recently industrialized north was much more prosperous than the rest of the country. This state of affairs was influenced by government policy, which encouraged northern growth at the expense of the agricultural south, where work was in very short supply, with consequent extreme poverty. This regional disparity led to animosity between Italians of the north and those in the south, and by the turn of the century, many Italian men from both the north and the south were leaving to seek seasonal employment elsewhere in Europe, in South America, notably Argentina, and North America. They hoped to earn enough in a few months to enable them to return home, but this usually proved to be an impossible dream. In the very early days, most of the migrants who came to Canada worked outdoors in the summer, doing things like railroad construction. Many of them often traveled across the whole country in one season. In the winter, when this type of work wasn't available, migrants mostly went to urban centers like Toronto, where they picked up casual work, for instance, manual laboring. The first Italians came to Guelph in the early 1900s. The city at that time was a small, quiet town, and local businessmen felt frustrated by this, knowing that slow growth was limiting their own prosperity. They believed that Guelph's commercial growth had to be more actively encouraged, specifically by promoting industry and creating a large industrial working class. The city started to subsidize the development of factories, and land was made available to accommodate new enterprises. Guelph also became the new home for many established manufacturing firms, and by 1911, the population had doubled. Thousands of workers were taken on, many of whom were Italian migrants. Until this time, male migration had predominated. The men often boarded together and found jobs and accommodation for those who came after them. The men, who were not yet official immigrants, clung to their own culture. Eventually, many were able to send for their families, or return to Italy to find a suitable bride, and in time, as the next generation of children was born in Canada, a new culture evolved, still based on Italian memories, but combined with the more immediate Canadian experience. The Italian-Canadian ethnic group, whose men and women had very different roles, established a stable and respectable community in the East End sector of Guelph. Today, it is still an active and thriving community, hosting an annual Italian festival in July.
Test Folder 9. You will hear part of a lecture about animal migration. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 10. Now listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 10.
Today I'm going to talk about animal migration, which is the seasonal or periodic movement of animals, including birds, fish and insects. This movement takes place in response to changes in climate or in the availability of food, or it can be to ensure reproduction. Migration most commonly, though not always, involves movement from one area to another and then back again. This is called round-trip or return migration, and it may be seasonal, as in the spring and autumn migrations of many species of birds. Whooper swans, for instance, nest and breed in subarctic habitats, and every autumn around 7,000 birds fly 800 kilometres from Iceland to Britain to spend the winter there. They reach a speed of over 90 kilometres an hour, and in good weather conditions can reach Scotland in under 13 hours. With the arrival of spring, they return to Iceland. In some species, the migration may require a lifetime to complete. Like other species of Pacific salmon, sockeye salmon are born in freshwater streams, travel to ocean waters, and then return to the stream where they were born. Here they breed before dying. Unlike some Atlantic salmon, which may repeat the cycle several times, Pacific salmon make the round trip only once. Migration occurs in a wide range of animals, from microorganisms in freshwater lakes, which shift seasonally from deep to shallow water as a result of temperature changes, to whales. Grey whales make a round trip of 20,000 kilometres each year. They have their young in the warm, shallow lagoons off the Pacific coast of Mexico. Then, in the late spring, they travel north along the coast of North America to the Arctic, where they feed during the summer. They return south in the autumn. European freshwater eels are thought to breed in the Sargasso Sea, a calm area of the Atlantic Ocean, north of the West Indies and east of Florida and Bermuda. The young eels are slowly carried eastwards by the Gulf Stream, and various physiological changes occur which will enable the eels to live in freshwater rivers and lakes in Europe. After a number of years, they return to the Sargasso Sea to produce the next generation, and the parent eels then die. In addition to round-trip migration, some migrations are nomadic in nature. This is where movement is irregular and depends on temporary local conditions. For example, ostriches, the large flightless birds that live on the plains of Central and Eastern Africa, move in response to varying local conditions of food and climate. In these migrations, the animals follow no regular route and don't return to any one place. Migratory locusts of Africa and Asia exhibit one-way migration to new sites. When their populations peak and food becomes scarce, enormous masses of locusts move to new areas, almost blackening the sky as they pass overhead. Migration based on the availability of food is often dictated by seasonal climate change. As the cold settles in, North American red-tailed hawks, for instance, can no longer find the small rodents and birds that they normally eat. This scarcity prompts the birds to fly south to warmer areas like Mexico to find a more abundant food source, and they follow this pattern each year. Plant-eating mammals, such as antelopes, typically graze in herds, which can quickly eat all the grass in an area. In the summer, the grass regrows quickly, but in winter it doesn't, forcing these herds to travel to find fresh food supplies. When spring brings new growth, the herds move back to the areas where they found food the previous summer. Great grey owls are birds whose migration is very variable, perhaps occurring one year and then not again for several years. The number of individuals taking part also fluctuates enormously.
Unit 18. The Study of Literature. 18.2. Exercise 2.
Right, sit down both of you. Now, Anna, you've prepared some questions for us to discuss today, haven't you?
Yes, I've been considering how literary translation should be approached.
Ah, yes, a very interesting area. Gary, could I just check whether this fits in with your current research?
Yeah, definitely. Funnily enough, I've been reading the French writer Émile Zola in translation recently.
Good.
Right. Well, my first question relates to the translator. Should a novel's translator have the original or the target language as their mother tongue?
And that's a good place to start. So, what's your view, Anna?
I should start by saying the obvious, that every translator needs to have a very good knowledge of the foreign language they're translating to or from. It's not enough to rely on even the largest of dictionaries, because they don't always help with literary nuance. For me, it's preferable for the translator to be a native speaker of the end translation's language, because then I think that work will read more naturally in its own right.
I take your point, Anna, but isn't there then a risk of the translator missing or misunderstanding something crucial in the source text?
I think that's always a danger with translations, whatever the nationality of the translator.
There are good and bad translations, after all.
Exactly. Another question I wanted to raise is this. Do novelists make better translators of fiction than other people?
That's another great question. Can you clarify why you're interested in this? Have you read any novels translated by other writers?
Yes, I was thinking of one particular series published in Italy, actually, which includes Calvino's translation of the French writer Queneau. The Argentinian writer Borges is translated in the same series.
OK, so based on this reading, how would you answer your question?
On the evidence of those titles, I'd say yes, writers have a real edge on other translators. In the one done by Calvino, for example, there seemed to be much more attention to the original writer's style, plus a genuine attempt to recreate it in the new language. And that's important, surely, but many translators seem to have a rather different agenda, in that they are trying above all to represent the content faithfully.
Gary, do you have anything to add here? Or another question to air, perhaps?
Well, to the best of my knowledge, I've never read a translation prepared by another author, so I can't really comment, although it does seem logical for one writer to be able to translate the work of another more sympathetically. Moving on. In relation to the 19th century writing of Zola, where lots of translations of the same titles exist, I know there is a lot of debate in terms of how the speech of that time has been rendered in translation. Many of Zola's books featured Parisian slang of the period in a radical new way, and it appears that that is difficult to capture.
Impossible. I know that an English translation of one of his books resorted to London Cockney slang, which caused quite a storm on publication, but that has a totally false ring coming from the mouths of French characters, and it also seems rather dated nowadays.
But that's going to be a problem with any translation, isn't it? I mean, language changes all the time, so should you translate a 1950s novel into the language of today, or is that a crime in itself because it takes the work out of its historical context?
Literary translation is one big can of worms. I can say to you now that I have no intention of becoming a translator myself, ever. However, and this is my final question, isn't a compromise text better than having no text in translation at all? We can't learn every single language, so we will always need translations, or be restricted to the literature written in our own language, which seems a very narrow way of approaching the subject to me.
Well done, both of you. Now, can you write up some of your ideas on this for me by next Wednesday? I'd like to go.
18.2. Exercise 4.
Writers have a real edge on other translators. Many translators seem to have a rather different agenda. I know that an English translation of one of his books resorted to London Cockney slang, which caused quite a storm on publication. But that has a totally false ring coming from the mouths of French characters. Literary translation is one big can of worms.
Unit 19. Earning a living. 19.1. Exercise 2. Questions 1 to 7.
As a way of earning a living, running your own business has two distinctive features. The first is that you don't go through the usual selection procedure. You're not competing against other applicants or facing psychological tests or cunning interview questions to test your suitability for the job. You're the sole judge of your fitness to start and run your own business. This puts a very heavy responsibility on your self-knowledge, because not everyone is suited to this type of work. You can also learn about yourself from the opinion of colleagues, friends or family, but this carries the risk of emotional problems. They may feel under pressure to give a favourable opinion for fear of offending you. Unless you can expect an objective view, it's better not to ask them at all. The second unusual characteristic of setting up on your own is that you decide what type of business it is and who you'll be selling to. If your business is well run, it stands a good chance of succeeding. In practice, however, you can make success more likely by selecting your product and market carefully. Although you may be able to create a demand for what you have to sell, it's much easier if that demand already exists. While many people dream of setting up their own business, not so many actually do so. Some, of course, are entrepreneurs from the start, starting a business without ever working for another organisation. Others, who have been employed, are sometimes pushed into making the change by external circumstances, such as being sacked or made redundant. They may have been thinking about becoming self-employed for years, but been too comfortable to do anything about it. It also often happens that someone is confident of being appointed to a more senior position within their organisation, and another person is chosen instead. This can have a very demoralising effect, and even destroy the satisfaction the person gained from their work. A third reason is when someone begins to feel that they've got nothing to show for the years they've been working. This may be triggered by reaching a particular age, such as 40, or by seeing friends or colleagues as being more successful.
Questions 8 to 14.
When you're considering whether or not to start your own business, you need to make a realistic assessment of what it involves, particularly while you're getting established. Your business life is unlikely to be easy. At the outset, and perhaps for some time, you may find you can't draw as much income from your business as you'd like. It can be very helpful if your husband or wife is earning, so that they can provide the funds you need to live on. While you might think you can choose when to work, in practice you'll probably find you have far longer working hours than you'd like. This is almost unavoidable. If your business isn't going well, you'll have problems to overcome, and even if it's successful, you may want to make as much money as possible in case things start going wrong. Running your own business can lead to a great deal of stress, particularly if you allow the business to overwhelm you. Talk to your family about your work and ask for their support so that you're not facing the problems alone. You'll need to be a salesperson, technical expert, accountant and administrator all in one. Be honest about your skills. If you can identify your weaknesses, consider being trained or try to afford expert assistance. Failure is very likely if you take a major gamble, but if you only want to pursue low-risk ventures, you may be short of ideas to follow up. The best chance of success comes from calculated risks which allow you to make a sound estimate of the likely outcome. Founding and controlling a successful business can yield a tremendous sense of achievement, but there may be failures. If there are, you must be able to accept failure without finding the effect devastating, and improve your future performance by drawing all the lessons possible from your mistakes, if indeed you've made any. You're probably wondering whether it's such a good idea to start your own business, but now I'll go on to some of the rewards.
19.1 Exercise 5 1. A.
Many people would love to be their own boss, but have too many financial commitments to take the risk.
1. B.
Many people would love to be their own boss, but have too many financial commitments to take the risk.
2. A.
This at least is the conventional idea, although many people like this never start a business.
2. B.
This at least is the conventional idea, although many people like this never start a business.
3. A.
Another factor that can cause problems when you start to employ other people is the desire for power.
3. B.
Another factor that can cause problems when you start to employ other people is the desire for power.
4. A.
Don't try to control your staff so much that they can't work effectively.
4. B.
Don't try to control your staff so much that they can't work effectively.
19.1 Exercise 6
When I was 14, I got a job delivering newspapers to people's homes. I had to arrive at the paper shop at 6 o'clock every morning, take the newspapers from around and cycle off and deliver them. And I needed to be at school before 9. I'd applied for the job because I wanted to earn some money. I hadn't thought much about what was involved, but I was sure there'd be nothing to it. But I was wrong. In most homes, the newspaper had to be pushed through the letterbox in the front door. And it was sometimes a struggle to find the right front door. A lot of them weren't numbered. Some letterboxes were at ground level or not in the door at all. And several were so small it took ages to get the newspapers through. Oh, and there was another problem. Dogs jumping up at the letterbox and trying to bite my fingers. I just about managed to get to school on time, but I was so exhausted that I almost fell asleep during a maths lesson. I decided not to go back the next morning, but then I thought of the money I could earn, so I changed my mind. Luckily, it was much easier from then on.
Test folder 10. You will hear a careers advisor talking to a group of students about applying for jobs. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 9. Now listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 9.
Now, I know that many of you are applying for jobs at the moment, so here's some advice on maximising your chances of success. If you've been invited to a job interview, particularly if it's your first, you're probably delighted that you've got that far. But you may be wondering how recruiters make their choice. They want to appoint the best person for the job, but how do they decide? Sometimes it's difficult to know exactly what they're looking for in an ideal candidate, so let me tell you what generally impresses interviewers. One important area is personal initiative. This covers a range of skills, competencies and qualities, and includes things like being a self-starter. That is, not waiting to be told everything, but making an effort to find out for yourself, asking questions, doing tasks that need to be done and which are within your capabilities. Initiative also involves showing a potential employer that you've identified your professional goals and have worked out how to achieve them, both the training and the hands-on experience that you want within the organisation. Most recruiters will be uneasy if you've applied for jobs as varied as an accountant, a teacher, and a sales executive. They'll suspect that you lack the necessary focus, and they won't expect you to be interested enough in the work or determined enough to succeed. Recruiters generally want someone who won't give up. In most jobs these days, people are working under pressure, and you need to be able to handle it. As the saying goes, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. Recruiters are normally interested in someone who's enthusiastic about getting involved, so you should show that you welcome a challenge. They also look for confident individuals who are adaptable and flexible. The ability to project the right image is a must-have skill for most employers. This means always behaving in a professional way and having respect for people, whether these are colleagues, customers, or suppliers. And this needs to be maintained even in difficult situations, and always make sure you promote a positive image both of yourself and of the organisation. If applicants haven't bothered to find out before the interview about the organisation they're applying to, it suggests that they aren't really interested in working there, so it pays to do some research. Then in the interview itself, you can ask questions that both impress the recruiters and give you the information you need. Job applicants very often undersell what they're capable of doing, and this may be because they've failed to review their experience so far. It's a worthwhile exercise to compile a list of your skills and how you developed them. Then, when you get to an interview, you'll have plenty of examples to refer to. You may be the perfect candidate, but you need to let others know about it. It's really important that one of your strengths is communication. You need to be able to put your point across in a discussion, take on board what other people are saying, and respond appropriately. Being at ease and able to chat with others on an everyday level is a valuable aspect of this too. I hope this is making you think about how to prepare for an interview and also how to behave once
Unit 20. It's History. 20.2. Exercise 2. Questions 1 to 7.
Today, in our survey of the social history of Britain, we're going to be looking at the seaside holiday, and I'll start with a brief overview. Nowhere in the country is more than about 150 kilometres from the sea, but for centuries the sea was the preserve of shipping. It wasn't associated with leisure, even for those people who could afford to travel for pleasure. Britain's annual seaside ritual began in the 18th century, with the new aristocratic fashion for sea bathing. Hardly anyone could swim in those days, and the main attraction of the seaside was the benefits of seawater and sea air for the health. Submersion in the ice-cold waves, followed by a glass of seawater mixed with milk or honey, was thought to cure all illnesses, so the aristocracy came in the winter. This fashion was soon followed by other people with money. In the mid-19th century, seaside resorts expanded rapidly as railways were constructed, connecting industrial towns with the coast. Far more people were now able to travel to the seaside, and sleepy coastal villages were transformed into booming seaside towns. They were no longer primarily regarded as health resorts, but as entertainment centres, and people generally went there in the summer. The holiday makers were mostly middle class, as they were the only people who could afford the expensive train fares and seaside accommodation. But by the end of the 19th century, working class families were also flocking to the coast from the industrial towns and cities. 19th century seaside resorts attracted distinct social classes, and their reputation as either upmarket or downmarket became part of the national folklore, continuing into the 20th century and even to some extent today. Resorts that catered for the mass market laid on popular entertainments and provided inexpensive accommodation to entice people to stay longer, as many working-class families could only afford day trips to the seaside. In the 1920s and 30s, seaside holidays boomed as never before, as doctors began to stress the importance of fresh air, exercise, and sunlight. This was because the poor state of the nation's health had become a major concern.
Questions 8 to 14.
From the late 19th century onwards, more and more workers had time off work with pay. But the trend was given new impetus in 1948 when Parliament passed an act guaranteeing paid holidays. Soon, 2/3 of manual workers were having a fortnight off each year, and the majority of working-class families had enough money to stay away for a week or two. Most chose to go to the same resort that they had previously visited on their day trips, usually the closest to where they lived. In fact, many returned year after year to the same accommodation. Group holidays involving extended families, streets, or even whole towns were still the norm. Entire communities went on holiday together, especially when the major employers in northern industrial towns closed down for a week or two in the summer. The success story of British seaside resorts ended in the 1960s. One factor was the new jet aircraft, which brought travel to Spain or the Greek islands within reach of far more people. Then, too, the ever-expanding international tourist industry organised flights and accommodation covered by a single, fairly low payment. This was the birth of the package holiday. Sunshine replaced the sea as the main holiday attraction, and an annual foreign holiday with a suntan to prove it was now taken for granted as part of modern life. With the even greater affluence of the last few years, it's no longer unusual to take 2 or more holidays a year. Maybe a long-haul flight to Thailand, Australia or the USA, plus a winter skiing holiday in Bulgaria, Andorra or Canada. And in between there may well be weekend breaks abroad, as the growth of low-cost airlines has meant that a flight to Spain or Italy can be cheaper than a much shorter train journey within Britain. Another change is that instead of the large groups of the past, the trend is for families to holiday by themselves. Many older teenage children and young people go on independent holidays with friends rather than their relations. And another trend is for school leavers not to go straight on to higher education, but to take what's called a gap year first, spending time in Australia perhaps, or travelling round the world. It's all a far cry from the seaside holidays in Britain of the past. Now, let's go on to another thing that developed in the...
Progress Test 5. This test is in the teacher's book. You will hear a student describing a book she has just read. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 4. Now listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 4.
OK, now the book I've chosen to tell you about is the Cambridge Companion to Australian Literature. It's an introduction to the subject and was published in 2000. The book was edited by Elizabeth Webby,
who's Professor of Australian Literature at the University of Sydney, and each chapter is by a well-known scholar or critic working in different literary fields in Australia, so the people who wrote it knew what they were talking about. This book begins briefly itemising what's happened in Australia in the past 2 centuries, including its literature. I found this very useful because I'm afraid my knowledge of Australian history is pretty limited. Each chapter of the book deals with a different genre or literary movement rather than different historical periods, although within each chapter the subject is dealt with from a historical perspective. The writers look at literature within its historical, social and cultural contexts, I suppose showing what makes it distinctly Australian. I think their aim is to introduce the subject to the interested reader from outside the country, and although an expert in the subject might find it interesting, it's probably more for someone like me who isn't a specialist.
Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 5 to 10. Now listen and answer questions 5 to 10.
The chapter on contemporary fiction starts from the late 1960s and examines the radical changes that took place around that time in the cultural atmosphere of the country. Previously, Australia had been perceived as a single culture, but with a change in government policy in 1974, many people began to emigrate to Australia from Southeast Asia. This increased the country's diversity a lot, and the society was now transformed into a multicultural one. In 1973, the federal government's Literature Board started to award grants to individual writers, publishers and literary magazines. And this gave a big boost to all sorts of literary activity and encouraged people to write who previously hadn't had the chance, particularly people from minority ethnic groups. There were several social factors behind these changes in the 70s, including improvements in global communication and the fact that travel soon became much easier and more affordable. Australia was no longer seen as an isolated continent far away from the cultural influences of the rest of the world. The section on the theatre shows that changes here have been even more dramatic than in prose writing. Financial support from federal and state governments meant that writers, actors and directors could do far more than before. New theatre companies sprang up around the country and actors and writers had much more scope to experiment in their work. Poetry, like drama, also participated in the cultural debate, partly because Australia took part in the Vietnam War in the 1960s. The writer of this chapter points out that it wasn't only the young revolutionary poets, but also established ones who spoke out against Australia's involvement in Vietnam. The final chapter describes the way that literary criticism has changed over the years in both universities and literary magazines. One thing that I found particularly interesting was the way that literature and literary criticism are affected by different moods in the country. In the early part of the 20th century, there was a nationalist approach to literature, which eventually gave way to modern and postmodern literature and literary criticism. Well, that's a brief outline of what the book contains, and now I'll move on to...